Should parents set up brokerage accounts for young children? Hi, this is financial planner Sean Mullaney. Let's discuss. So, some parents out there are thinking, hey, you know what? If I set up a brokerage account for my newborn or my young child, that can grow to be tens, hundreds of thousands of dollars when they're an adult. Or, you know what? Maybe I'll set up a brokerage account for my young child to help them learn about investing and finances. Well, I have three concerns with the tactic of setting up brokerage accounts for young children. Hi, this is financial planner Sean Mullaney. Let's discuss. My first concern with setting up a brokerage account for a young child is this. It prioritizes a tactic, right? Setting up a brokerage account for a young child over the goals of young parents, right? So let's think about parents. They've got a newborn, or maybe they've got a 10-year-old at home, and they're thinking about maybe doing this tactic where we set up a brokerage account for the young child. Well, before we do that, shouldn't we be thinking about the parents' primary financial goals, right? I'd argue that for most parents of newborns, most parents of 12-year-olds, most parents of 9-year-olds, their primary goal, which they probably have not yet achieved, it should be stabilizing their own finances so that their own financial future, their own retirement is highly secured, or is at least going in that direction. And only once that primary goal has been met, then maybe you look to secondary goals like a child's financial future. And maybe then you would deploy a tactic such as a brokerage account for that secondary goal, right? So I think this idea of setting up a tactic and prioritizing that over more important primary goals is just not a good idea for young parents. My second concern with the tactic of setting up a brokerage account for a young child is this. And I come at this actually from, before I get going, from a little bit of a different perspective than a lot of other financial content creators out there. I think there's some unintended consequences to this tactic in terms of unintended lessons we're accidentally teaching children, even though we don't intend to do that, right? The intention is, oh, you know what? Look, Junior, look at this ABC mutual fund. Look how it grows, and look at, occasionally it declines in value. Look how it receives dividends. Look at what happens when you put $100 in there. That $100 grows the account. We think we're teaching children great lessons about investing and personal finance. I'm concerned, though, that we're unintentionally teaching them the wrong lessons about personal finance. And here's why. Think about the lived experience of a 10-year-old child. Think about the lived experience of an 11-year-old child, or when you were 11 years old. Weren't you mostly concerned about your family, your siblings, what was going on in school, what's going on with your friends? What did Keith Hernandez do against the Montreal Expos last night? All right, that was more me. But for most 11-year-olds, here's what happens, right? Their lived experience is defined by certain factors, right? Their friends, their siblings, what's going on in school, what's going on at the swim meet or the Little League game or karate practice, whatever it is, right? It has almost nothing to do with any account balance anywhere in the world. And what I'm worried is going on here is you set up a brokerage account for the 11-year-old. They say ABC Mutual Fund, it's worth $500 and it's in their name and they get to own it. And then they see it goes up to $700. It goes up, say, 40%. I think that's the math there, right? It goes up in value, and it has nothing to do with their lived experience. Their dinner's the same. Their science class at school's the same, right? Everything's the same, even though allegedly this investment is doing so well. Isn't that very subtly teaching the child that investments don't matter? That personal finance doesn't matter? I'm worried that we're having this disconnect, and it might be teaching the wrong lesson to the 11-year-old kid. Okay, so that's my second concern. Here's my third concern. It's actually a little bit of a nerdy, technical concern. What about this? Think about you give your child a mutual fund when they're 8 years old, or maybe cash that then becomes the mutual fund, right? Think about the child's tax basis in that asset, right? If it's cash, it's just the cash that you gave them when they were 8 years old. If it's a transfer of your own mutual fund to them, then it's your historic basis in that. Think about that basis, right, versus, well, maybe instead what you do is you keep the mutual fund, you keep the cash, you invest in your own name, you then have the asset as the parent for your own financial stability, and maybe things go really well in your finances, and then you pass away when the child is maybe in their late 40s, early 50s, mid 50s. When the child as an adult inherits from you, guess what? There's no capital gain. They get the step up in basis. So you can do some income tax planning for your children by simply keeping the asset, let it grow in your name, and then you pass away when you're elderly, and guess what? They get the step up in basis. Why forego that, right? Why forego good tax planning for your kids when you get to keep the asset, right? So I think some parents might want to think about maybe you should just keep the asset. So, hey, you'd have the benefit of it if you needed it. And oh, by the way, your kid gets a step up in basis only at your death, though. So that's something to keep in mind. So we're thinking about this issue about how do we raise financially literate children? And I'm going to offer two alternative suggestions. My first suggestion is this. Your child needs church much more than they need the bogleheads. With all due respect to the bogleheads, they're wonderful. But here's what I mean by that. A young child needs moral character and development. And here's the thing. If your child is religiously involved, if your child has good moral fiber, they're likely to be a more well-rounded and grounded person. And that's the type of person that is more likely, no guarantees in life, but that's the type of person, even as a young person and then as a young adult, middle-aged adult, they're more likely to have financial success. So if I was a young parent, I would focus on developing my child in I'm Catholic, right? My religious tradition, you should think about your religious tradition, develop them that way so they become more of a grounded, well-rounded person. They're much more likely to be financially successful if they have that firm moral footing. All right, here's the second way I would try to raise a financially literate child. It's just by being a good example as mom and dad, right? So think about teenagers, college students, young adults, right? Sometimes they just default to how mom and dad did things, particularly with their finances, right? If mom and dad set a good example with their spending habits, their investing habits, mom and dad don't have to teach Junior about the intricacies of the mega backdoor Roth. It may be that the child just picks up through the great example of mom and dad the right tactics and lessons in terms of finances. And, obviously when you're 8 years old, you can't pick up on some of these subtleties, but you'll be in a position where you've got a great foundation. Your family of origin taught you well in terms of the basics of personal finance. And then in your 20s and 30s, you could add on some of the bells and whistles and really optimize in terms of personal finance. So those would be my two suggestions in terms of how do we raise financially literate children. Hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, please mash that like button and subscribe to my channel. I'll see you next time.